welcome back to Cycling Books. It's 5 years now since COVID-19 entered all of our lives. Riders began getting the virus at the UAE Tour. The cycling season was in jeopardy. Things were particularly bad in northern Italy, and we all, utterly selfishly, hoped that Milan-San Remo and Strade Bianche would be unaffected. Then, Paris-Nice came to an abrupt conclusion, and that was that. No more bike racing, no more anything. We were locked down. My lockdown consisted of myself and my wife juggling our working hours while trying to keep the kids entertained at home. I was just settling down into my job at GCN and really didn't know what the future would hold. The launch of GCN Race Pass, as it was known before it became GCN Plus, had been postponed, and instead we focused on a really quite novel idea of showing old Giro stages re-live with talking heads of interviews with the main protagonists and journalists interspersed with the commentary. So my cycling lockdown memories are of doing lengthy video interviews with the likes of Nicholas Roach, Michael Rogers, Ed Pickering and Herbie Sykes. Cycling lockdown for Ned Boulting was very different. Ned had serendipitously come across a reel of old cycling footage. It turned out that it was 150 seconds worth of the 1923 Tour de France. Ned spent his lockdowns and beyond trying to find out everything, absolutely everything about what was going on that roll of film. Who were all the people? Where were they? When were they? What buildings were in the background? What was that bridge? Was it still there? Ned picked apart every inch of information available and let himself wander down avenues, allowing the past to wash over him and overcome him. Then he wrote a book, quite a marvellous book. I sometimes get labelled as the cycling stat guy, and I don't mind that really, but stats are not why I enjoy cycling, not really. Myself and my friends Harry and Stu have started a separate podcast about exactly this. Did not finish. Please go and have a listen if you haven't already. It's about taking a cycling stat, but not just taking it at face value, taking it and peeling it like an onion, dismantling it to see why things are the way they are, tasting the rich fruits within, the tastes of history, geography, geology, politics, war. And that's what Ned has done here, to the nth degree. He's peeled the onion provided to him in the form of this footage of the 1923 Tour de France and gives us an incredibly rich view of what cycling and what the world was like 100 years ago. So I'm joined now by Mr. Ned Boulting. Thanks very much for coming on, Ned.
That's a pleasure, Killian. It's been a long time.
Yeah, it's been a few years, yeah. Well, it's been a few years, and the last time we did this together, it was. I think we did one about 101 Damnations, and I'm sure we talked about the Yellow Jumper book as well. So, is it a source of serious pride that you have now written a serious cycling book that doesn't contain a cartoon version of yourself on the
cover? Yeah, I mean, that was a big ambition of mine, to have a book that merited a photographic cover rather than a silly cover. But in order to do that, I had to write a book that had, and I think I'm right in saying this, I've said it often enough, so I'm starting to believe it myself, but I think I'm right in saying that 1923 doesn't contain a single joke. Maybe there's one or two whimsical comments that could be construed as jokes, but not really. I don't think they cross the threshold of a joke, which is, yeah, for me, that's a big, that's a quantum leap.
Well, I mean, I phrased the question as a silly one, but I'd imagine that there is some seriousness to it that, I don't know, in some quarters, you may have and maybe are perceived as like a source of humor more than seriousness, but that actually this book is really quite serious. And was it kind of irritating that maybe some people didn't take you seriously?
Yeah, I mean, irritating. It was definitely something I kind of wrestled with a bit, because in the entire evolution of, if you think back to the, my God, it's been 25 years, but of tours, or 24 years of tours. In the evolution of my career, I guess I've had to balance two things simultaneously, which has not always been easy or straightforward. One is the absolute transparency and honesty that I've had to learn from um, a complete outsider's perspective. That I had no history in the sport, that I was coming to it completely from a standing start, and that I didn't want to pull, nor could I have pulled the wool over anyone's eyes that wasn't the case, because it was staring you in the face and it was there for all to see. So I never wanted to hide that. I never wanted to disguise that. And I guess, um, you know, humor was a part of that sort of acknowledgement. But on the other hand, it's been a long time, and my career sort of changed within the broadcast world from reporting, which is one thing, to commentating, which is quite another. And there's only a certain amount of innocence or ignorance you can bring into that role. You do have to have, at that point, I think, a degree of authority when you speak, or certainly credibility. And so holding those two things together has not been straightforward. And I've wanted to try and do it as honestly throughout my career as I could have done. But none of us stay the same person, do we? We change with time, and that's certainly been the case in my journey through cycling.
Yeah, and like when you kind of sat down to start writing this book, I mean, it had been nearly 20 years that you had been kind of at the forefront of cycling coverage. So, like, just by definition, you had
Yeah,
become a source of authority and you know um, someone that need not suffer from imposter syndrome anymore. Did you kind of struggle with that idea that all of a sudden now you are writing now as somebody with authority, and to park the kind of outsider role that you had played up till now, and now you need to write as though you really do know what you're talking about. You're not on the outside looking in, you're on the inside now telling us what's going on.
yeah, it's interesting that you put it like that. I suppose I've not thought about it in those terms, but I suppose it was such a providential kind of lightning strike of a moment, acquiring this film and then instantly setting off on the journey that it took me on, that I didn't have time to stop and think, how do I approach this? It just straight away was what it was. And I hadn't, and I guess only now with hindsight have I realised that I obviously, in doing so, crossed some sort of Rubicon that you've just outlined. That maybe that was the moment where I could leave behind all that slight pretense of, not pretense, that's the wrong word, or that slight unease or insecurity of having to prove myself. And that, because ultimately, you're right, Killian. You like no one is exposed to the Tour de France as a fetus. In utero, it's impossible. Even, well, unless Elon Musk might fix that in the years to come for us all, I guess. But so there is a point in all our lives, no matter how steeped in the heritage we are through family members and inherited traditions, we all discover the Tour de France for the first time at some point in our lives. It just so happened that it was a little bit later in my life. But if you hang around long enough, turns out you do become somebody who's on the inside, as you say.
And like you said, when this film role came into your life, you never really stopped to think, and it just became what it was. But at which point did you stop to think, "Huh, I could and maybe should actually write a book about this"?
Probably within 40 seconds.
Really, yeah,
Yeah. See this window? So this is the room I wrote the book in. This this
yeah,
this that's the window there where I held the reel of light, the reel
yeah.
of film that I couldn't yet. That I held it up to that, and I saw these still images that were completely captivating. And within seconds, I understood what lay ahead of me, and I couldn't wait to get started.
Do you miss lockdowns?
No, no. I wondered what you were going to say then, because I wondered whether you were going to say, "Do you miss writing the book?"
Mm.
And I do miss writing that book. I feel when I finished it and it got published and went out into the world, I almost felt a sense of bereavement, because enjoyed's the wrong word. Because it took my life over so completely. Um, I kind of mourn the absence of the process, and wish I was still doing it. Do I miss lockdown? No, I struggled. I mean, lockdown. Yes, it gave me the opportunity to write the book and gave me the time and the space to write the book. But I was as close to being. I'm not an unhappy person, but I was as close to being sort of emotionally unwell as I've ever been in my life during those lockdowns. I hated them with a
Mm.
passion. Yeah, I found them very. We all did, didn't we? I found them very, very difficult indeed.
Yeah, I well, like I mean, so did I. I'm sure so did everybody. But like, I do find myself some moment. Like, I had a moment yesterday. Actually, I was walking around with my daughter, who is 6 now, and for whatever reason, we ended up on quite a busy stretch of road, which didn't really have a footpath, and it was quite dangerous. And she stopped and said, "What? Why are there so many cars on this road?" And it just reminded me that. During lockdowns, she was still in a buggy, and we used to push her
Yeah,
along this road. There was nothing. There was no cars. There was no trucks. There was nothing. And I remember saying that to her. I said that to her yesterday. Like, this used to be where we walked you, and it was lovely. It was glorious. It was an absolutely beautiful route with no cars and trucks. It was just a little glimpse back to actually there was some good aspects to lockdown. And but maybe you've wrapped that up with what you've just said there. With you miss writing the book. That's what you miss.
yeah, but aside from the book, just going back to what you've observed about lockdowns, you see, yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, on the face of it, I remember the weather over in the UK was glorious during the first. Don't know whether you had that in
Mm.
Ireland as well, but it was unusually warm and sunny for long periods of time. It was London was empty. It was extraordinary. There were no airplanes passing overhead. All that is true, and yet I couldn't enjoy it because it was a false. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the actual settled state of things. It was deeply
Mm.
unnatural, and so I never could embrace the opportunities that presented. I just felt wrong. It felt like a perversion of what life is actually like. A bit like, I don't know whether you get those same thing as I do, but when you get a really surprisingly warm late September day
Mm.
and you think, oh, summer's still kind of, and it's not though, and you can't enjoy that because you know that actually it's just a blip and that pretty soon winter's going to be rolling in. I felt like
Mm.
that a little bit in lockdowns. I could never actually embrace the kind of opportunity that I was presented with me in that sense.
And
So I
you
just hid.
said like,
I just hid at this desk. I just literally didn't move from this desk and disappeared into another century. That's what I did instead.
yeah, and like you said that there was a feeling of loss when you handed it in and you were finished. How how did you decide to finish it? Was the visits that you made to France and Belgium, and when they came to a conclusion, was that the conclusion, or did you have to struggle with the end and say, right, I'm going to stop digging now. That's enough.
It, all along, I'd wrestled with that because could have been a journey with no end. There
Yep.
is no end to some of the little avenues that I started to run down. Most of them had nothing to do with cycling. They were geopolitical or historical or cultural sort of cul-de-sacs, not cul-de-sacs, avenues that had no end. So that was difficult. Where do you draw the line there? But actually, in the knowledge that there must be some sort of finish line in mind, from quite a way out, subconsciously I had, and then consciously I had worked out that the biggest single symbol or image in the book, and this is a spoiler, by the way, but like you say, I think most people will have read the book. The biggest single symbol is the bridge over the River Vilaine in La Roche-Bernard that Théophile Beckmann attacks on. And when I found out that that bridge had been destroyed in this freak accident in the Second World War, when a bolt of lightning had struck it after the German army had mined it with high explosives, um, I knew that that bridge sat at the center of the story. This is an interwar story. The bridge is the bridge as a symbol in itself stands between your point of departure and your point of arrival. It bridges something, bridges a span of time or a span of geography. And I knew that that was such a powerful image that actually to plant my feet on what remained of the bridge would be as far as you could go, especially given that the bridge doesn't exist. And if you go to La Roche Bernard, all you will see are the stone foundations that used to hold up the iron span. They are enormous, by the way, and you can walk out slightly dangerously. You can walk out on them, and look at where the bridge used to be. And I thought, if I can just physically get myself to that point where I can go no further, then that works for me. That is a point beyond which you can't go, and that's where I was aiming to in the narrative. And indeed, physically, that's where it took me to. Don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely does. And was there ever was it a problem to convince a publisher that this was worth turning into a book, or did that just come easy?
No, it was probably one of the easiest sells I've ever had.
Yeah.
I think it's and there were a handful of trusted people I spoke to when I started writing, and honestly, all you have to say is, I found a real film, and it's mysterious, and I want to know everything about it, and straight away people are on board with you, and it wasn't a difficult book to convince people of at all. It's quite a difficult book to write, mind, because um, another thing that I did differently with this book. I mean, there's so much that's different from anything else I'd written, but another, quite important departure for me was that every other book I'd written up until that point had 20-25 chapters
Mm.
of kind of 3, 4,000, 5,000 words length each. This one couldn't work like that. There was no way that I could write it in chapters. So I had to, very early on, make this decision that I would break it into fragments, and that some of the fragments would be the length of a chapter. Other fragments would be, a paragraph or a line. So I loosened the whole structure up to open up a different way of telling a much more complicated and multivariate story.
And was this specific period in European history something an itch that you wanted to scratch anyway? Because, like, I think if I had heard that, oh, Ned Boulting is writing a book about the 1923 Tour de France, and it had actually nothing to do with finding a piece of film, and that wasn't actually part of it. It was just something that you were interested in, and you wanted to write a cycling book about the 1920s. I would have kind of thought, oh, yeah, that's not that unusual. Maybe Ned would write a book like that. But that wasn't what happened. It was because of this film, so it was kind of happenstance or chance. Did, were you interested in this particular period anyway, or was this new? Was this a new thing for you to start scratching around in the 1920s?
Yeah, the latter really. It wasn't a decade that I'd ever stopped and thought about greatly, until I started to look into it, and I only started to look into it because of the film, and then everything that led from the film. That said, I think it was kind of like planted on fertile ground, because and this, I hope, emerges a little bit from the book. Um, with the two languages that I speak, French and German, um, this story kind of plays out at the heart of this seismic clash of the continental plates of European culture. The Franco and the German conflicts that had been going on for hundreds of years, and then finally came to what we hope is an end in the 20th century through the cataclysm of the two great wars. This is stuff that interests me, and it interests me because I have great affection and I hope some understanding for both France and Germany, and indeed Belgium, which kind of like weirdly sits on the rift between the two cultures anyway. And so all that interests me, that cultural side of it, the linguistic and cultural side of it. And then, 1923 was almost dropped into that soil and grew from there. And then I discovered very early on stuff that I simply didn't know. And this is central to the story, that under the terms of the Versailles Treaty, which changed the shape of Europe for the worse and created the ground for the Second World War, the French and the Belgians had literally occupied the Rhine and the Ruhr valleys and started to confiscate German steel and coal after the First World War, which has, of course, created hyperinflation. Hyperinflation then led to the rise of the Nazi, and then the chain of events kind of leads seamlessly on, in my opinion, to the outbreak of the Second World War and the rise of Nazism. And it just so happened, and this blew my mind, that at the very same hour when the riders are setting off on stage 4 of the 1923 Tour de France, the one that the film is from, the bomb goes off again on a bridge in the middle of the night that is a symptom of all these kind of geopolitical crises that are unfolding. And then I had this kind of like what really interested me and made me very paranoid and quite worried for a long period of time when I was writing it is I was sitting at this desk fascinated by this stuff that I was learning for the first time in my life, and then reaching these rather tentative but quite grandiose conclusions about the importance of the summer of 1923 in European history, and putting them down on paper, almost in the voice of a historian. And I was thinking, no, never mind about imposter syndrome, about who's in the breakaway that day at the Tour de France.
Mm.
This was a whole different level of imposter syndrome. I'm thinking, is this a massive overreach on my part here to even behave as any kind of historian seems risky. And one of the things, this is a very long answer, but this might be of some interest to your listeners. One of the things that publishing houses do when you come up with a working title for a book is they do a bit of a search to see if anyone else has used that title or something close to that title in the past, or if anyone's got anything planned that has a similar title. And they put 1923 into their search engines and found out that a couple of books called 1923 were indeed going to come out at roughly the same time that my book came out. A book written by a German historian and a book written by an Irish historian, actually, who has written about the year being the forgotten year in Hitler's rise to power. I was very nervous about both these books coming out to see if they reached fundamentally different conclusions from the one that I had tentatively reached. And I read them both when they came out. They came out before mine. And to my immense relief, they basically, in a much more historically and evidence-based way than I did, reached the same conclusion that 1923 was indeed absolutely pivotal in the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War.
Had that kind of nagging doubt made you give your manuscript to any historians before it got published to say, please check this so I don't seem like an idiot in any way? Just go over it, please.
No, I didn't do that. I thought about it. I didn't do that because I didn't want to, like ask a stupid question, get a stupid answer. Like
Yeah.
I didn't want anyone to rip it up before it had even seen the light of day. So I think what I did instead, Killian, in the text was I made sure that at every turn I undermined my own voice.
Yeah.
Like I wanted people to know that history is an unreliable science, and that history is, particularly when it's written by someone like me, is subjective and subject to error. And there are points in the book where, for example, I literally inhabit Théophile Beckmann and write a first-person narrative as if I'm him. Now, clearly, that's not history. That's just my imagination running away with myself, And there's a tiny little fragment in the film where, not in the film, in the book, where I talk about watching a film called The Girl with the Chewing Gum, I think it's called. And it's a film that was made in the 1970s. It's a short film, very art house film, where a camera has just been locked off on a London street. And all you see is people unaware that the camera is there, coming and going, crisscrossing and moving. And some characters carry a shopping bag in and then walk back again. And the whole film is narrated by this omniscient seeming sort of godlike narrator who is like almost calling the actors forth and saying, now we need the guy with the shopping bag to come back in, and like making up stories on their behalf, even though he's got no idea who they are or what they are. But he's the kind of unreliable narrator. And yet what he's doing is investing a kind of emotional truth in the scene as well, which is a very pompous and convoluted way of saying, this book was my truth. Yeah. But I don't for a minute presume that it is the truth. If you buy my truth, then that's fine. But that's as far as it goes,
The passages where you kind of assume or enter Beekman's head.
Yeah. Yeah,
I found interesting because I remember pitching a story to Andy McGrath, who was the ruler editor at the time,
yeah,
where I wanted to write something about Shea Elliott. He's
yeah.
the Irish cyclist from the 1950s and 60s who had a bit of
And
a tragic,
what a story Shays is as well. Like
yeah,
what a story. Yeah,
a tragic ending
very.
to his life. And part of that I pitched as doing the exact same, entering his head, and while he was in a bike race, I think, assuming that I was him. And Andy said no, that it was too presumptuous to do that and too risky, and it won't. He doesn't think it would be like right. Or I'm paraphrasing. I can't remember his
Yeah,
exact
yeah.
words, but he kind of said, "No, it's not." I don't really know what the word is. He didn't feel comfortable with it. Did you get that? I mean, were you slightly uncomfortable doing that?
It took me a long time to hit upon that moment in the book where it's quite late on where I start to do that, and it was quite late on in the writing process where I think I do it 2 or 3 times in the book.
Mm,
They're very brief and episodic, but I'd already reached a point. See, I wasn't dealing with Shea Elliott, whose life is both quite well documented, quite well known, and quite recent
mm,
um, as well. I was dealing with someone effectively whose life had been borderline erased. Like even his granddaughter, with whom I made contact, knew nothing about him. You know, the last belongings that they'd taken out of the house in which he died, they took to a charity shop and it disappeared. You know, they have no pictures of him even. They didn't know anything about his. So almost nothing of Teo remained. In fact, I found myself in a position where I was, walking around planet Earth in receipt of more knowledge about Teofil Bateman than anyone else in the world, including his descendants. So I felt in a position, and that put me in a position where I don't think I was pretending for a single second that this is what Teofil Bateman would have thought, but I had almost, to some extent, merged with him a little bit, or
mm.
he'd actually started to inhabit me every bit as much as I'd started to inhabit his space. Um, and I couldn't help myself. That's what I wanted to do. Because it's how I thought of him. When I thought about riding a donkey on a rest day in Les Sables d'Olonne, when I read about his serial sort of brushes with greatness that just stopped short of being memorable, or everything was always snatched away from him at the last moment, I I identified with him, Killian, as weird as it sounds, and so I didn't hesitate. I do remember my editor did sort of flag it up as an initial note and went, "This surprised me. I was reading a bit of non-fiction and then this pops up, and at first I wasn't sure, but then two or three, after 2 or 3 iterations, I went with it, and I think you'd earned the right to do that by that point." And but it was a subtle and interesting shift to sort of drop in, yeah. But
I
I get what you're saying, and I understand Andy's position every bit as much as your impulse
yeah.
to write for Shay and on Shay's behalf. But it's there's a riskiness about it for sure.
With Bakeman himself, then, are you kind of glad in a way that he remains largely a mystery? Like, would it have been overly climactic? Like, imagine if you had found his granddaughter and she had this like absolute treasure trove of comprehensive history of every aspect of his life. Would that have been too climactic and almost uh, kind of null and void your journey that far to have just suddenly discovered everything? Like, is it important that he kind of remains unknowable?
Only in as much as that's how the book ended up. The book is what the conclusions that the book reaches, or the way it is written and framed, is only as a result of the real life exploration that concluded in that manner. Had had Therese had this room full of memorabilia and handed me his diaries that told me everything, the book would have gone in a different direction. Don't get me wrong. When I went to Nineveh and they told me, in fact, they dropped me off at the charity shop where 10 years previously they handed over this bin bag full of his stuff. I spent 2 hours rummaging around in their storeroom on the absolutely infinitesimally small chance that some of this stuff still remained. I was that borderline distraught and upset that I couldn't get hold of it. So I would have loved to have found that stuff. And at that point, I worried for the book a bit because I thought, no, this is a proper dead end here, isn't it? Like, what do I do with this dead end? That's not how books normally that's not how they conclude. That's not how stories, there has to be a kind of a revelation. But I realized that it wasn't there. And so that's what I had to go with. There was no other reality I could construct other than the one that was presented with me. And so I had to react very honestly and emotionally to what was unfolding, and that's just the way it went. So I would have loved to have written a different book, and it would be very interesting to compare the two. But that's where Theophile Beckmann's life ended up.
Has it changed your approach to commentary in any way? Like a lot of the Tour de France stages end up with, these hopeless breakaways with riders who, even people who, like me and you, who are obsessed with this sport, maybe don't really know much about, and you have to like furiously look them up while the race is in progress. Has it changed your kind of attitude to these guys that actually these guys are not anonymous? There are 1,000 stories about every one of these guys, and have you put on kind of new spectacles now when you watch a bike race?
I think I always knew that. I think I always knew that. It is nonetheless easier said than done, isn't it? To invest in the modern peloton. I mean, look, this was looking at a race that was 100 years old. Already it's dripping with meaning, isn't it? Like a mystery. When you're commentating on Paris-Nice and there's a guy from Uno X up the road, it's you know that this guy from Uno X has probably got he's got a soul, he's got a character, he's got a backstory, he's got a real life, he's got emotions, he's got all that. But all you're probably going to know about him is that he does a bit of cross-country skiing in the winter, and that his dad was a keen cyclist from Stavanger, and that he was a Norwegian under-23 time trial champion or the runner-up. And that's about it, because he's an Uno X rider, and they are devoid of mystery. So listen, I understand it in principle, but in practice, what am I trying to say? In practice, is this? I think we've spoken about this in the past, Killian, that it doesn't take long, but bike races accrue meaning through time, which is why when we set up the road book, you and I together, we always knew that the best road book would be the 2018 road book, the very first one that came out, because it's like ancient history. So it kind of like it's got texture and like, oh yeah, and stuff, but what's happening bluntly in high definition live before your eyes is the stuff that sometimes doesn't matter as much, if that makes sense. Like when we look back at, it's a bit of a digression, isn't it? But when we, in the years to come, God willing, if we're still around, and we look back on Vingegaard and Pogacar battling for the Tour de France, oh my God, it's going to be like watching Coppi and Bartoli. We're going to go, we're going to question ourselves. We're going to go, did we get as much out of watching that live as we damn well should have done? Because that was at the absolute peak Tour de France, and it's happening in front of our eyes. It's sometimes hard to invest the present day with the emotion of the past.
Yeah, that's a fair answer. Yeah, I completely get that. It accrues importance as the years go by. I think on that same note, like definitely something that comes across in your Never Strays Far podcast, particularly the ones you end up doing on your own, and just wandering around, really obscure places on mainland Europe. You have this ability to find wonder in the mundane or seemingly mundane, and I mean, on those podcasts, it sucks you in. You certainly make me want to know more about the things that you're talking about, like that ability to scratch and find wonder anywhere. Have you always been like this, or did cycling do that to you?
Great question. Cycling did that to me. Great question. That's such a good question. And And one of the many ways in which cycling does that to me is it mixes the grandiose and the mundane so
Mm.
beautifully. I'll never forget. There are so many little bits of geography. This is almost psychogeography, isn't it? But there are literally bits of geography that mean so much in cycling, and yet they're so mundane. Like you think of that little car park that Thomas Voeckler ended up circling around when he sort of like came off the road on that descent. Was he wearing the yellow? He was in the yellow jersey, wasn't he? I think
Yeah,
on the
yeah,
descent, possibly to Pinerolo in 2011. I think it was that stage. But that's just funny, isn't it? And I remember going there on a subsequent tour and or driving past it and going, hang on, that's the car park. And like, we literally had to stop and go and stand in it just to revel in its sheer banality. You know,
it,
I
it's
love that.
yeah. It's funny you say that. That's actually a very recent realization for me. Like, because I've been to the Alps and the Pyrenees, and they're just grand and glorious anyway, even without bike racing. But it took a trip to Flanders to make me realize this, where I was I was cycling up the I mean, I think it was probably the well, it was, first of all, it was the Molenberg and then the Koppenberg. Anyway, I did a few of these climbs. I found myself thinking, like, is this it? Is this the Molenberg that we kind of talk about and revere? And it's just it. I know I've read about, yeah, it's just a muddy farm track, but like, it really is just a muddy farm track. It might as well be round the corner from me here, but over there it's like, oh, it's the
Yeah,
Koppenberg, and
yeah,
it takes seeing it outside of a bike race to make you realize, this is just normal mundane stuff. But we do that to it. We put these places on a plane where they don't really belong, but bike racing does that to them. It's quite amazing, really. Yeah.
yeah. And it's not, I was in, so that, thanks for your kind words about the Never Strays Fast. I just
Mm.
completed these 5 days of the Étoile de Bessèges.
Yeah.
And the race finished in Arles, and I spent the night after the race finished in an Airbnb in Arles. And when I woke up in the morning, the race had gone.
Mm.
Like it had absolutely taken over the town. And then the next morning, I just went and had a coffee and wrote some postcards. And there was not a trace of the Étoile de Bessèges. It had evaporated overnight.
Mm.
How magic is that? How magic is bike racing the way it does that? It drops in, it takes places over, and it just evaporates. So um, I don't know. Is that the same phenomenon? I think it's related to that phenomenon of the everyday
Mm.
mixing with the slightly more aspirational, and then cycling's infinite ability to look amateur and to behave in a slightly sort of like shambolic fashion will never leave me and will always be a source of amusement and fascination. Like at the Étoile de Bessèges, I think it talks about it in the pod. Um, Paul Magnier won the first stage, and with it, of course, the white jersey, the points competition, the race leader's jersey, and the stage win. So he was up on the podium. As the winner of stage one is always like on the podium 7 times, and he'd been given like sponsored gifts and trophies in just super abundance, and no one had stopped and thought, how's he going to get them off the podium? So I was just standing there like the only journalist there, just roaring with laughter watching him. Never change cycling. It's just it's great, and yet Paul Magnier is an absolute weapon, isn't he? And what he just done was remarkable, and he might go
Yeah.
on to be the defining sprinter of his age. So
Yeah.
there's something incredibly admirable and grand going on at the same time as this wonderful shabbiness.
One thing that I did wonder, I think you explain it in the book for a couple of the characters in the film, but not all of them. Is how did you identify them? And I think I'm right in saying this, but maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. As far as I spend a lot of time on social media, and I think everybody did during lockdown. As far as I can remember, you didn't ask for help publicly to do
No,
this. So, well, first of all, did you do that on purpose? Like, did you want to keep this to yourself and figure it out yourself? And secondly, then, how did you do it?
I mean, when I'm writing, I write like that, like the kid at
Yeah,
school who keeps his. Well, it's a very bad thing to do in a podcast, but what I'm doing is hiding my work. Um,
yeah,
I write like that. I don't like to show people unless I absolutely have
yeah,
to, even my editors. So it wasn't a thing I wanted to share. Besides, it was a very private world I was in. How did I identify? So specifically, the two star riders, I guess, who I managed to identify. It goes beyond that. I identified a lot of them actually, but the two star riders. Well, Ottavio Bottecchia. The more you look at him, the more you realize he had a very distinctive body shape, a bit like Victor Campenaerts, square
Yeah.
shot. And also bear in mind, my job is identifying bike riders.
Okay, like if you
So
showed us a picture of Victor Campenaerts now with his face blurred out, we might be able to identify him because we've seen him lots.
yeah,
But you
yeah,
hadn't seen these guys, so what were you
no.
comparing to?
Um, yes, that's a very good point. I had no idea what Ottavio Bottecchi looked like. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of still imagery, and that's all I had to work on for these star riders.
Yeah.
It turns out Bottecchia had very square shoulders, and he had a beaky little nose. And when I suddenly realised, and I don't know why it took me so long, but in the film clip, if you do look at it, and maybe you could put it in the show notes or something, Killian,
Mm.
you go back and you look at the long shot in the middle when they're just riding along this dusty road. It's about
Yeah.
45 seconds long. You realise actually that one rider, that his kit is distinctly lighter in tone than everybody else's. And it was months into looking at this film. I said, "Oh my god, that's the yellow jersey, right? It was only the fourth year of the existence of the yellow jersey, but that is the yellow jersey." And then obviously I knew that the yellow jersey that day was worn by Ottavio Bottecchia. So I then looked at the body shape and looked at some still images and went, yeah, without a shadow of a doubt, that's Bottecchia. So that was a relatively straightforward one. Excuse me. Henri Pellissier, who goes on to win the Tour de France, in that same shot is riding right in the right-hand gutter. And he's less identifiably different looking. Certainly his kit doesn't give you any particular clues. But what made me realize that he was definitely Pellissier is that riding behind him is Francis Pellissier. And Francis Pellissier is huge. His slightly less talented brother, younger brother, Francis, is twice his size. I mean, he was one of the tallest men, if not the tallest man in the peloton in 1923. And he did have a habit, as I cross-referenced by looking at still images from all the various different newspapers of that year's tour. He
Mm.
did have a habit of riding behind his brother, but working as a sort of backmark. Well, you see it in the modern peloton, don't we? Sometimes, you have a rider sometimes just holding your back wheel as well to sort of make sure no one takes your wheel. And Francis would often ride behind his brother. And when I saw in the film that there was a very small rider on the front and a very big rider at the back, just behind him, I realised, oh, I wonder if that is the Pellissier brothers. And actually, it 100% is when you look at in detail at their kit and everything from there. So it's a very pleasurable kind of few months that it took me figuring all this out.
And have you kind of tried to find? I mean, do you find yourself scouring auction houses for more? Like, do you think that there are more of these lost films out there that are waiting to be discovered?
I seriously doubt it. And one of the reasons is straightforward and practical. The film predates celluloid.
Mm.
So this film was printed on nitrate film, which is, and always was, extremely dangerous as a substance. So, unbelievably, the auction house that sold me the film in the first place, they had no idea, just as I didn't actually, that this is a dangerous substance. And it literally landed in a jiffy bag, of all things, came through my letterbox and landed next to the uppipe of a radiator, which could have burned my house down.
Well, I
Because
think you say in the book that having this substance in your house voids your house insurance.
yeah, it does. It does. I didn't know that at the time. So it was always a dangerous substance, Killian. So I think what happened was, they would have take the Tour de France Pathé coverage, for example. They would
Yeah.
the tour back then was 15 stages long, a rest day every other day, and they would produce short films in batches of 3 stages. So they would have a certain numbers of meters of film that they would then carefully expend over 3 days of racing. And then they would, and this is why film footage like that is called rushes, they would rush it back to Paris from wherever they were. So they'd stick it on an overnight train. It would be rushed to Paris, to Pathé Cinema, where someone would edit it and then duplicate it. And they would print onto nitrate maybe a dozen reels of these 3 stages, the highlights from 3 stages, that then the next day would be in cinemas being projected in the big cities. But I would imagine once they'd been projected, they were thrown away because, like, they were chip paper. It's like, why would you hang on to that? It's been and gone. It's not
Yeah.
worth keeping, and also it's incredibly dangerous. So I think the stuff was just destroyed, which accounts for the fact that there is so little in existence of that time. Very, very little.
And the fact that, like, you have written this book and spoke about it in various places, has anything come to light, or has anybody come forward to explain themselves as to the person who had it before, or the person who put it into the auction house in the first place? Like, have you discovered the origins of the film itself as a result of you writing about it?
It I didn't realize this, but auction houses that sell stuff like this are incredibly protective of their sources.
Oh, okay.
I think I think a lot of the stuff is quite dubious origin and borderline sometimes stolen goods are getting kind of like auctioned off. So they're like, "Why are you asking?" And I
Right.
said, "Well, because I'm like a." And I tried to explain the importance of this, and they weren't that engaged with it. Right? They said, "Well, we got it from an auction house in Germany." And I said, "Can you put me in touch with the auction house in Germany?" And they went, "Absolutely not." And then I said, "Okay, can you tell me anything? Would you mind asking a question on my behalf then?" And reluctantly, they did send me a message to say that the auction house in Germany had got hold of it from a collector in France, but that was as far as I got to know. So its origins are pretty mysterious.
Okay. And
But but yeah, there's no other reel of pathofilm knocking around in the world. I don't think. I think that was a one-off.
we have something in common now, unfortunately. In recent months, we've both been told our main touch point with cycling, our main jobs within cycling are gone,
Yeah, yeah, very true.
finishing. And I know some of my former colleagues at GCN have kind of drifted away from cycling a bit, out of spite maybe, and like an innate kind of unresolvable disappointment. Have you any concerns that this will happen to you next year?
Um, well, listen, I still cover the darts for writing. No, I can't conceive of a world any longer where I turn my back on this sport. I mean,
Yeah,
it's not going to happen.
yeah,
I won't allow it to happen. Obviously, I'm, I'm not. I did see it coming that ITV would relinquish the rights. I think it was a tremendously long period of time that they had the rights for. Actually, quite unusual in broadcasting, in sports broadcasting, for one
mm,
event to sit with one broadcaster for such a long period of time. So, like, I've been in telly long enough to know that these things happen, and I'm not naive enough to have said, I saw it coming. I was still slightly surprised by the timing, but I saw it coming.
yeah.
Um, but I'm not, I'm too invested in the race one way and another, not to, if we're just talking about the tour, to turn my back on it. No, no, I'm not going anywhere, mate.
Well, and you're a substacker now. How how do
Yeah,
you
yeah,
how do you feel about like the landscape of cycling media in general? Because it's very different now to when to when you started getting into cycling, and then when it kind of, I don't know, peaked at maybe 2014, 15, maybe, and
yeah,
now here
probably
we
around
are.
then. Yeah, yeah. Um, well, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what to feel. So we're speaking the day after the Netflix pulled the plug on their coverage, which
Yeah,
was, you think about it, it's not so long ago they joined in, and there was a lot of talk about this being the game changer for cycling. This would be,
yeah.
they didn't hang around very long, really. So that's another not necessarily encouraging sign. On the other hand, I have to say, like, despite the fact that for many people it's now too expensive to contemplate, obviously for me, to doing what I do, I'm absolutely signed up to subscribe to TNT Sports or whatever the hell they're called now,
Yeah.
and where my colleagues and friends still work. And I have to say, like, unless they change things, and I don't think they are, the sheer breadth and depth of races that you can follow blows my mind, actually. And so that's a good thing. I don't think that was there when I that wasn't even there in 2014. The number of races that you could,
No.
So that's good, and I hope that doesn't change. Substack's an interesting one because I think it allows writers like myself and you, and to express ourselves in ways that are less constrained by the ethos or the requisite kind of tone that's being set by just publishing your work on someone else's website. It's and I think we are beneficiaries in the cycling world of an audience or a readership or an audience who are both full of understanding and goodwill to support projects and people who they understand are going above and beyond and offer something to them. I think it's a fairly safe space in which to operate, and I feel a lot of kind of mutuality in our interests. And so Substack has been I've only been on it for a couple of months, but it's been an absolute delight. Yeah, I've really loved it.
And I suppose on that same note, with maybe specifically book publishing, because I think back in, when I say the cycling media peaked in 2014-15, I think I was particularly had in mind the volume of books that were being published at that time. It was really capitalizing off the back of Wiggins and Cavendish and Team Sky and in the English language, books being published was. It felt like there was one a week was coming out, and now it's definitely not the case anymore. Do you think whatever book you've got cooking next would be difficult to convince a publisher that actually there's still an audience here for cycling books? I know it's slowed down, but there's still a massive audience here.
Well, I can't say what it is, but I've got a book coming out in the summer, being published by Bloomsbury, and so there's still an audience there. It's reduced, and I think one of the things that kind of occurred at that point in time where books were coming out very thick and fast was that there was a great thirst of people, a bit like myself actually, who were still quite new to the sport, who felt that they wanted to find out who the great riders were. They just didn't know. And so there was a great thirst for the big biographies of the great riders. And one by one, they all got ticked off, and there are only a limited number of riders whose biographies kind of stand that kind of treatment. And then everybody wanted to know what the monuments were and what the Tour of Flanders were. And so the great histories kind of got written in short order, and within about 5 or 6 years, we were done. The kind of all the important big subject matter had been covered off and ticked off. So I think that also kind of slightly exaggerated the kind of sudden boom and then apparent bust of the cycling publishing market. I think there was always going to be a limited number of titles that could come out that touched all those different points. So
no clues as to what your next book. It's a cycling book, I presume, is it?
It is a cycling book. All I can say is it'll be more familiar territory, and there will be jokes.
Okay.
The jokes have gone back in.
Cartoon
there might even be a cartoon.
Yeah.
There might be a cartoonish sort of. There might be.
Okay. Well, listen. Thank you very much.
But the book after that, I'm planning, that won't have any jokes in it.
Cycling related still.
Back to no jokes. I really can't talk about that one, Killian.
Okay. Well, look, on that note, thank you very much for joining me, Ned. I really appreciate it.
That's really interesting chat, as ever.
And really loved the book, I have to say. Absolutely, joined you on your journey through 1923. It was fantastic.
Thank you very much. Cheers, Killian. Good luck to you.
Well, I very much hope you enjoyed that chat between myself and Ned, and I very much look forward to discovering what new cycling book Ned will have out this coming summer. His book, 1923, The Mystery of Lot 212 and a Tour de France Obsession, is fantastic. Please go and buy it from a local bookshop. The bollocks billionaires do not need your money. My name is Killian Kelly. Twitter has gone to shite, so you can find me primarily on Blue Sky these days, and I think I'll start to join Ned on Substack, and we'll be dabbling a bit more there in the future. Please join me again soon for another episode of Cycling Books.